So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through and I'm going to show you how to import all of these invoices onto Xero. There's quite a few benefits to using an import rather than posting them manually. You have to consider, while I'm not processing many invoices here, so in this particular instance I would say it's not worth importing. If you're importing hundreds and hundreds of invoices a month, same with the bank, if you're posting loads of bank, it's going to be a lot more controlled and a lot more faster to import them onto Xero rather than post them one by one. And as well as that, it can be quite a lot easier to manipulate the data beforehand and make sure that the data is correct before you put it onto Xero. Now you'll see that the one thing that we do need is the Xero account code, and you'll remember from earlier when we're talking through the chart of accounts, you will need to refer to the chart of accounts to be able to create this in the first instance. Once you've gone through and you've done it a few times, you'll be able to look at your profit and loss reports or your trial balance, and then you'll be able to get your account codes from there, and it will be a lot quicker than scrolling through the chart of accounts in the first instance. So the first thing is we're going to need to know how to tell Xero to import these and basically give it to Xero in a way that it can read the information. So thankfully we're going to have a template for us to be able to do that. So in order to get to that, we're going to go to Business, Bills to Pay, and then we're going to go to Import, and then thankfully we can click here to download a template. Now all we need to do after this is to transpose the figures here over to this template that's currently loading up. Now the first thing you'll see is quite a lot of columns, and thankfully we don't need to fill in all of these, and thankfully most of them we can ignore. If you want to fill in these and have a record of that on Xero, if that's beneficial to you in any way, then by all means. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through and I'm going to hide everything that isn't needed and talk through what we need to do. Now if we get this up side by side with our purchase and sales invoices, what we're wanting to do is transpose this. I'm not going to do it all now because I've already done it, but other than that it's relatively self-explanatory. So contact name, that would be the supplier. The invoice number, while I've actually just made one up and done it in numerical order because I need one, but the invoice number will be whatever is on the invoice that you've received. The invoice date is the date on the invoice, and the due date is the due date on the invoice. Now one thing that I will say beforehand is quantity I would always make one. There's no need to make it anything, even if you're buying 10 of the same item. I think it doesn't really add any benefits. So for example, if I bought 10 things for £10, Xero would raise an invoice for 100. I don't see the point of doing that. You can just have quantity of one for 100. I imagine if you are managing inventory, then that is when these tools would be useful, but generally speaking it's a far more simplistic and easy to manage if you always have the quantity as one and then the unit amount. So one thing that you might have noticed, if you're particularly aware, is that we have no gross, that and net columns. All we have is unit amount. So what we need to do is tell Xero, does this figure include the tax or exclude the tax? So if we go back to Xero right now, you'll see that there's a tick box here, is the unit amount field tax inclusive or exclusive. Now if we tick tax exclusive, that means we're going to be using the net figure in here, and if it's tax inclusive, we're going to be using the gross figure here. So for all intents and purposes we can ignore this VAT column, but what we do need is the tax type. Now I think right now it's probably a convenient time for me to get up the import that I already have, and that is this. So here's one I made earlier. So you'll see that in the tax type what you need is the exact description in what is actually in the chart of accounts or the tax type. It needs to be exactly in the same format that Xero would recognise it, otherwise it doesn't particularly like it. And the way to figure that out would be to go to chart of your accounts as usual. Or alternatively, you could raise an invoice manually. Oops, sorry, wrong area. So you'll see, for example, here we'll have the tax rate. You need to copy that to the T. Thankfully, you can just copy and paste it, whether that's here. So once you've done it once, you can just copy and paste it all down. But it is very important that you recognise at this point whether the VAT rate is correct. The reason that Xero does this is because it makes it impossible for you to put a invoice on with 17% VAT or something like that, because that isn't a feasible tax rate. It doesn't exist. So with all of that in mind, I've used the unit amount as my gross figures, so I'm going to have to click that includes the tax, and then outside of that, Xero will do everything else itself. So now I've shown you how to import your invoices by way of CSV, which is a lot better if you do it in great volume. I'm also going to show you now how to do it manually, which is probably a little bit less technical, and it can be a lot nicer if you're doing your bookkeeping on a day-to-day basis rather than in monthly batches. But you're essentially transposing exactly the same information, but you're just having to fill it all in a little bit more manually. So from is effectively the customer. So if I'm pretty sure I've created one with Garage Limited. That's where Test Limited bought their van from. And you'll see that there's already a customer there. So that's where you create a customer, and then the description isn't a mandatory field, but it's where you would like to fill it in. Let's just say materials. We'll say it's from Glass Limited. You can see how creative I am. We'll say that the term date is plus 14, which we'll just add 14 days onto that. Reference, I'm sure you're kind of getting the idea by now. Quantity, as I touched upon earlier, will always be 1. Unit price, we'll go for 600, and you'll see here that the amounts will either be tax exclusive or tax inclusive, so that's where you account for that. So I'm going to put tax inclusive again, so then Xero will know that my tax rate, once I set 20%, it will absorb it within the 600. From here, I'm going to put it to the right code, and you'll see that exactly the same information of which we put into our import has now been transposed onto here, and then we can go ahead and approve this invoice, and it will add it to the list. I'm not going to do it because I've already created them, but if I posted that, it will be added to the list and be an outstanding invoice with the rest. Now all of these invoices right now are outstanding, so we're going to go ahead and reconcile them.